Our next presenters today are Dr. Laurie Gage. She is our zoological field specialist with USDA APHIS Animal Care, and she's being joined by Dr. Sara Tobias. She's a veterinary medical officer for USDA APHIS Animal Care, and today their topic will be USDA Bat Inspections. Dr. Gage.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you're in the world you are joining us. Thank you so much for coming to our Bat Welfare Symposium and coming to our paper, USDA Bat Inspections. So I'm going to be delivering this together with Dr. Sara Tobias. And I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about the Animal Welfare Act. So this is a US federal law that was established in 1966 for to ensure humane standard of care for animals. And the animal welfare regulations provide the detailed standards that are used by the USDA to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. So this gives Animal Care, that's the agency that I work for, gives Animal Care the authority to carry out the law. And we do this by doing inspections, for which we're going to discuss in the next few minutes. So the way that we operate is we have a number of regulated activities and regulated animals for which we use this law for. The regulated activities are for animals that are exhibited to the public. So that would be like zoos or circuses or educational exhibits, show business, entertainment, or animals that are sold as pets or used in research. Teaching, and then we also regulate commercially transported animals. And the regulated animals are all warm-blooded animals and birds now, which is a more recent addition to what we've been regulating in the past. So all warm-blooded animals and birds, with the exception of farm animals that are used for fur, fiber, or food, rats or mice that are bred and used for research, or and we also do not regulate horses unless they are used in biomedical research. So I wanted to call all of you veterinarians that are on this call today, I wanted to bring your attention to how important you are. And we have defined in the Animal Welfare Act, under Part 2 in the regulations, we have Subpart D, and that has a lot of information about what we expect for you being an attending veterinarian, how important you are. So one of the things that we have an expectation of is that you're going to support the humane treatment of the animals in your care. You're also going to be contributing to the success of the regulated facility. You're going to make sure all these animals have adequate veterinary care, and you're going to be developing a program for all these health-related aspects of care. So that might include husbandry and disease, preventive treatment programs, and even employee knowledge. So you might be responsible for training some of the employees to understand a little bit better about the species that they're working with. So you have authority. This is very important, veterinary authority. And this is over all aspects of veterinary care. Again, so adequacy of cleaning or disinfection, rodent control. These sorts of things can be under your authority, and you can ensure that the facility for which you're being the attendant veterinarian for is carrying out all of your expectations of animal care. So we have an expectation that the facility will be following your program of veterinary care and following your treatment instructions. Now, some of the more common veterinary care non-compliances, if our inspectors go to a facility and they find something that's not correct, they'll write up what's called a non-compliance. And for the veterinary care non-compliances, it would be failure to contact the attending veterinarian in a timely manner when an animal is sick or has a problem, failure to follow the attending veterinarian's instructions, or failure to observe all animals every day. And we heard a lot about this in the previous talks, how important it is to observe every animal every day. And if our inspectors might find some little bats, for instance, in this photo, if there's sick or dead bats that are found in the fold of the fabric of the facility where they're living, our inspectors are the ones who find these animals. and it wasn't the caretaker that found them, this could result in a non-compliant item because there may be a failure to observe these animals. And we feel this is so important that we've created these animal care aids. And this is just to help the licensees understand and give them some best practices about how to better organize their daily observations. So we have an expectation that all the animals will be observed every day to assess their health and well-being, and not only their physical health, but their behavioral health as well. So we have two different aids on this, and Amanda Lawler went into this very beautifully. So we have these aids to help out people who may want to have a little more information. Also, for the attending veterinarian, there must be appropriate facilities and personnel, equipment, and services that are available to the attending veterinarian so that they can do their job. Now, we do have resources for attending veterinarians, and you can go online, you can go to our web pages, and we have animal care tech note, for instance, and we also have other really useful information on this website. But we have a tech note in particular that talks about the authority and the attending veterinarian, and we also have that same tech note written in Spanish. So I'd like to tell you now a little bit about our animal welfare regulations, the standards, and this is what we're going to be discussing today. So we have standards for all different groups of animals, and we've just recently added subpart G, which is birds. So we start dogs and cats, and we go through subpart F. It carries the standards that are all the covered species that aren't mentioned in these other subparts. And those would be our zoo animals, and that's where the bats land, is in subpart F. And these are going to cover facilities and operating standards, animal health and husbandry standards, and transportation standards. So when we look in the Blue Book, we call this the Blue Book, the Animal Welfare Act and Animal Welfare Regulations. When you see the different subparts, you'll see subheadings within those subparts. And so these are just gives you an idea of what we're going to be discussing today, everything from the facilities where the animals live down to the employees and even transportation of these animals. So when we administer the Animal Welfare Act, that's AWA, the Animal Welfare Act, we do this through doing inspections, and these inspections are unannounced. Our inspector is going to show up sometime, generally during business hours, but it'll be an unannounced inspection. And we call it risk-based. And risk-based means that if you are a wonderful facility, do everything right, you get all your daily observations done, everything, our inspectors don't find any issues with you, the chance of you getting frequent inspections is low. If you have more risk of having non-compliant items written up against you or against the facility, it's more likely that that inspector is going to be coming more frequently. So that's what we call risk-based. And our inspector is going to visually examine and evaluate all of the animals that are covered by the Animal Welfare Act that are on the property. So all of the animals are going to be visually examined, as well as the enclosures, the support areas, and they're going to take a look at the husbandry and veterinary care, medical records, contingency plans, and other records like acquisition and disposition records. So all of these things are very important for you to have available for our inspectors when they come. And the inspectors also might call the attending veterinarian just to find out if, in fact, the facility for where you work is following your program of veterinary care and following your various treatment plans. So I just thought it'd be interesting to show you. And Dr. Theodorson this morning, when she gave her introduction to our symposium, mentioned some of these numbers. But we took a look at the bat facility inspections that our inspectors did over a 5-year period between 2018 and 2023. Our inspectors they completed 692 inspections for the 203 facilities housing bats. And then those facilities housing bats are located in 35 states and 1 territory. And as you can see, the vast majority of facilities that we regulate are Class C exhibitors. And then there's a few dealers, a few research facilities. And during that period of time, over 70,000 bats were inspected by our USDA inspectors, and that was 44 species of bats. Now, I just thought it'd be interesting to you to show that the Seba's short-tail bat, it just happens to be the one that had the most numbers in our system. And that was followed by 3 species of fruit-eating bats and then a common vampire bat. So this is by number, this is the top 5 bat species that were inspected in the United States. So now I'd like to take you on a little tour, and we've now arrived at a facility that has bats as a part of their collection. And so I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Sara Tobias. She's one of our very seasoned inspectors from the northeastern United States, and she's going to take you on a tour of how she looks at things, how she conducts a USDA inspection. Sara?
There, it helps if you unmute, Sara. Good afternoon, everybody. After listening to these erudite and knowledgeable individuals, I want to pull you back down to the ground and talk a little bit about what inspectors do when they arrive at your facility. And we look at a grand variety of facilities. Some of them are big and beautiful and very well funded, like this particular place with this gorgeous atrium. And if you look up at the top there at that little black dot, you see a little bat clinging there. But we're just as happy to go and look at smaller facilities and see healthy and happy bats. And so we're going to look at the components of your animal husbandry program that are going to lead to you having happy, healthy animals, like a general overview that includes structural strength, your water and power capabilities, how you're doing your waste disposal, and even the availability of your washrooms and sinks for your employees so that they don't represent a health hazard to your bats, as Dr. Klein had noted recently. We look at indoor and outdoor facilities, and for both of those types of facilities, they have to be safe for your animals. So they need to be well constructed, both to protect the animals from injury and also to contain them. We want to be sure that the facility isn't going to fall down around your animals when they're clinging to the screen there. They've got to protect your animals from predators as well. We just heard about what a small opening a bat can squeeze through. Well, every weasel in the neighborhood is going to be looking for that opening as well, because those bats are nice, tasty little meals for them. So we want to be sure that we're looking at an enclosure that is well constructed and secure from the outside, but is also in good enough condition so that it's not going to injure your animals from any of those practices. If you have nice thick wire and you're cleaning it frequently, rust tends to build up over time. Sometimes that can flake and present sharp edges that might injure your animals as they are clinging to the walls or they're clinging to the ceiling. And we're going to look for loose connections between the screens or between the edges of the enclosure or any rotten wood that might mean that there is a weakness in your enclosure that other animals could exploit and that your bats could get out of. For anything you do in your facility to maintain a good environment for your bats in captivity, you've got to have adequate water and power supplies. And so we'll ask you about that. We want to know that your electrical system has been put together in a safe way. It's not going to spark a fire that might injure your animals or impair your abilities to take care of those animals. And we want to know that you have adequate potable water available on the premises that's provided to your animals in a way that doesn't involve green slime, like that water bottle in the middle of the screen there. We're going to look to see that you have support spaces that are adequate to the needs of your facility and for your collection. We want to see that you are storing food and bedding in a way that keeps it wholesome, that prevents it from getting contaminated by vermin, by mold, or by bacteria. We want to see good practices like storing it off walls and off the floor and in closed containers. We also look to see that you have adequate refrigerated supplies for feed and other items that need to be stored under those conditions. We want to make sure they're functioning properly. So we'll look at things like seals and make sure doors shut and ask you about the maintenance of those things. When we are looking at storage, particularly for food supplies, we want to see that your food items are being stored in such a way that it's keeping your food wholesome. We don't want to see a tower of boxes that's fallen over that you have to dig through to find unspoiled bananas. Likewise, we might see a better situation such as we have on the other side of the screen, but we would still want to see that those bags were closed. So there wasn't infestation by grain mites or by mice, or you weren't inadvertently raising a really nice colony of cockroaches in your feed room. All of these things also rely upon your ability to get rid of the other end of that food provision, and that is the timely removal of wastes. Now, the Animal Welfare Act does stipulate that you have to be in compliance with all federal, state, and local laws and regulations around waste disposal streams. So please be aware of that and make sure that you're maintaining those waste streams properly. You want to make sure you're minimizing the opportunities for vermin to come in, chew through those bags, find delicious snacks. We want to make sure that you're not propagating odors, that there isn't an ammonia buildup in enclosed spaces because of your wastes. And we want to see that your waste streams for things like trash and debris are separate from your waste streams for dead animals. Don't store your carcasses in your food refrigerators, please. We want to make sure that your food is kept sanitary and that any of the wastes aren't contaminating other parts of your facility. Some of the wastes that are generated by keeping animals are not going to be those consumable or moldable, are not going to be things that will rot. However, you still have to have a pretty good method for managing that kind of waste stream like this one. It's appropriate to have a collection area for things like old cages or old refrigerators, but you want to manage those so that you aren't inadvertently creating a beautiful habitat for a colony of rats, so that you aren't inviting in opportunistic animals to live there and become disease vectors for your colony. Then you have an indoor facility. I mentioned the importance of having good power supplies before. Well, that power is used for doing things like keeping appropriate temperatures, and that means heating or cooling animals as appropriate for the species to maintain a healthy environment for them. And the way we're going to assess that is by looking at the general health and welfare and the behavior of your animals. Are they normally congregating as a social species? Is anybody spread out? Are they trying to dissipate heat or generate heat by shivering? You don't want to see any of that, and neither do we. We will also ask you to talk to us about how you're providing adequate ventilation. In an outdoor enclosure, it's probably natural ventilation. In an indoor enclosure, there's going to be some artificial component. And what we want to see is that animals are comfortable. So that can wildly vary depending on where your species come from and what their natural environment is. But what is important is that the ventilation is appropriate to the comfort and welfare of your animal. You can manage that in as simply a way as blocking drafts with a piece of cloth on the front of this enclosure, as this facility has done, or in a more complex method where you might be maintaining bats in a research facility, for example, as Dr. Klein mentioned, and there may even be there may be some pretty significantly advanced filtration capacities. So there are lots of ways to do this right. We do want to see that you're providing appropriate lighting. And what does that mean? Well, an inspector is going to ask you about your light cycle. How are you helping your bats to maintain a normal circadian rhythm for that species? At the same time, you've got to have enough light for those animals so that you can actually see them every day and perform those good observations to make sure they're healthy. Your employees or yourself may also need special light to be able to clean them appropriately. Let's say you have a reverse light cycle. We're going to come and inspect during the day, and you're probably going to be taking care of those animals primarily during the day. Well, maybe you've got a red light so that your visitors can see the animals in red light. We'll be happy to inspect by red light as well, just as long as you provide it for us and you can convince us that it's adequate to meet the needs for good husbandry for your colony. When you are taking care of bats, there's going to be a lot of cleaning involved. We all know that. And so one of the other things we assess is whether or not your drainage is adequate. It's got to eliminate water quickly because we don't want puddles standing around, right? Soapy water like this is not appropriate for bats to be drinking or really any animals. So your drains have to be in good working order. And they've got to prevent a sewage backup. And we also want to know that there isn't a population of sewer flies that's building up. Those are not necessarily appropriate for providing that a little extra bit of protein that was talked about in the nutrition talk. And we want to make sure that there are no foul odors generated that could be bothering your bats and impacting their welfare adversely. If to be in a temperate climate and to have some outdoor housing, it's really important that you think about how your bats are maintaining their own homeostasis in that environment. We need to make sure that at any one time in any outdoor enclosure, everybody in it has access to shade and has access to shelter. A lot of these enclosures are not covered, so there will be a need for some kind of shelter, which can be fancy or simple. This is a fairly simple setup here where there's a part of this enclosure that has a cover so the animals are protected from rain. There's got to be adequate room for all animals in this enclosure. And you want to think about how animals move into this enclosure, particularly if you're in a climate like mine, where part of the year your animals might be inside and part of the year they might be outside. You need to have an acclimation plan for those animals. How do you develop it? Well, hopefully in partnership with your attending veterinarian, we can give you some guidance about what to look for and how to develop an appropriate plan to make sure that your animals don't suffer undue stress or get sick from moving from one environment to the other. And of course, in this outdoor enclosure where there's potential for rain to build up as well and create some puddles, we want to know that you have adequate drainage, not just because we don't want the bats to be going for any little unauthorized swims, but also that you're not creating an environment for mosquitoes to build up that would then feed upon your bats. When you have bats outside, there's something else you need to worry about, and that is human contact. So you are required to have a perimeter fence for any outdoor housing enclosures. It's got to be a minimum of 6 feet high, and it's got to be a minimum of 3 feet from the wall of the bat's primary enclosure. And that perimeter fence does protect the bats from some animals. However, some animals will climb or fly. And so when we think about bats outside, we're really thinking about the protection from persons as a primary concern. Those protections from people sometimes can lead you to be concerned about whether or not you have enough space for your bats. And so when we're looking at your primary enclosures, we're evaluating your primary enclosures to make sure there's enough room for bats with this glorious wingspan to all spread out at once. We want to make sure that there's not only enough room to spread wings, but there's also enough room to roost together comfortably for social species or for animals that need a little more protection from weather or for animals that need to have a little bit more modified space, maybe for a geriatric bat with arthritis, as was mentioned earlier in the discussion about maintaining those older arthritic bats that have fall risks. We want to make sure that that space is appropriate as well. Your bats have to be able to have normal social interactions. And one of the ways they have to be able to interact normally is around their diet. So there's got to be access to all the bats in that enclosure to their diet at one time. We don't want them fighting and bickering over this food. The food has to be species appropriate. It's got to be wholesome. It's got to be accessible to everybody. So if there are young animals in there and older animals in there, there has to be a way for all of them to get to it. The professional standards for the species are what we expect to see when we evaluate your diet. So we'll be looking to see that you have the guidance of your attending veterinarian, but also that there is some way in which you've become educated about what the species needs are for your animal, and you have provided that diet in a wholesome way. It can be difficult to make sure that food receptacles remain clean. Bats poop everywhere. So you may have to think about putting food receptacles at different levels in the enclosure and hanging them in different ways. It is critical that those food receptacles don't contaminate your diet. So we'll look for caking in the corners. We don't want to see any mold buildup. We don't want to see rust, and we don't want to see that there are any ways in which those food receptacles could injure your animals by having sharp edges. We also want to know that you're accommodating the very young or the very debilitated animals by providing good access to all of those food receptacles. This is a typical setup that I will often see, and this could be perfectly acceptable. But if I come as an inspector, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Number one, are those bowls really going to be comfortably accessed by all the animals in the enclosure? Sure, they're on the side of a screen, and that screen may or may not be appropriate for the size of the feet of the bats in your enclosure. But could you, for example, hang from the ceiling and still reach a bowl? Or is it only adults who could access the bowls that way? Do they all have to climb up the sides of the enclosure? And is that appropriate for all of the bats in your enclosure? Do the bats hang out and congregate above the bowls and poop inside them? These are some of the things that you have to consider when you are going to evaluate a facility. And we ask that you be the experts here. You know your animal's normal behavior, and you know what's appropriate for them and for the species. And I want to talk a little bit about fruit flies. So anybody who's delivering a diet to frugivores knows that fruit flies are a little fact of life. When an inspector comes, they don't want to see a situation like this. We don't want to see that you have chopped up fruit sitting out on a counter next to your food stores, for example, those bananas back in the corner. And we don't want to see that there is something right next to those fruit bowls, like that bottle of hand sanitizer that could potentially contaminate the diet if you were to think about washing your hands in the middle of preparing the diet and squirt it onto your hands. And we really don't want to see that you have any bug spray out in the area that you're preparing diets. So please think very carefully about the safety of your animals, not only when you're providing the diet, but when you're considering how you work with the diet and deliver it to your animals. Bats consume a lot of water if there's some species. I was shocked to find out that there are some species that are actually drinking at least 50% of their body weight in water in any one 24-hour period. For those species, you're really going to need to provide them water at all times. What the law says is that you've got to give them potable water, so water that is meeting the hygiene standards for human consumption, as often as necessary for the health and comfort of the animal. So what do you want to think about? You want to think about the age of your animals. You want to think about the species. You want to think about the condition your animals are in. Have these been rehab animals that maybe need to have their water provided in a different way than your other animals in your collection or in that enclosure? You want to think about the age of the animals and the size and the type of the animals. And it's really important to remember that if we come and we see an animal that we have a suspicion maybe is a little dehydrated, or we don't see a water bowl in the enclosure, we might ask you to provide that. And then we're going to stand there and we're going to watch your bats access that water. And if they look like they're really thirsty, we're going to turn to you and say, hey, this doesn't look like it's appropriate. What do you think about that? What's your plan? Why are you in this situation? Because we know that you want your animals to be happy and healthy as well. The animals produce a lot of guano. That's a fact of life with bats. And as an inspector, I can tell the difference between an enclosure that's just ready to be cleaned on a normal basis and one that's had an abnormal buildup of wastes. You've got to remove those feces and urine often enough so that your bats are not affected by a buildup, either of the odors they produce because of the potential for bacteria and fungi to grow in those wastes, and the transmission of other diseases. you also want to be sure that whatever your cleaning method is, that it doesn't stress out your animals. You can't be wetting your bats because you're spraying the walls of your enclosure. So when you are considering your enclosures, you need to be thinking about that design very carefully and ensuring that there's a safe way to get things clean that doesn't harm your animals while you're in the process of it. Also like to see that the general premises are kept clean and in good repair. We don't want to see buildup of things that impedes good ventilation. We don't want to see a buildup of trash inside a facility, for example, that's going to attract vermin, as I discussed before. And we want to see that you're getting rid of those wastes as needed. It is very important as well to think about how you are evaluating your entire facility so that you're not encouraging those pests to come in. This isn't inside a facility. This is just on the outside of the facility. But what's happened here is that there is a very nice little home for rats under that piece of tin roofing, and they are enjoying living there. They're going out to forage as often as they can, and they're becoming a problem for this facility. So we're going to look at this from your housekeeping perspective, but we're also going to look at your pest control program and say, are there pests there? Are there problems? Have you got a safe and effective method of taking care of pests, whether they be insects, whether they be ectoparasites, whether they be avian pests like pigeons coming into your facilities, or mammalian pests? And we're going to open those drawers and we're going to look in those cupboards, because if we see things like these little black grains of rice here in a drawer, and those are not grains of rice, those are mouse fecal pellets, we're going to have to ask you questions about what you plan to do about that, because we know that you don't want your animals getting sick from contact with these opportunistic little beasties that will move in happily. In addition to that, I want to take just a minute to mention that everything we talked about today has to be done for your bats by humans. So as we come as inspectors, we're going to be looking to see if you have enough hands to be able to perform all of these tasks. We want to know that you have enough people to do the job properly and that they're adequately trained. For example, they're safely using gloves to handle this species so that they're not injured by a bite. And then that poor bat isn't put into danger by having bitten a human. We do like to see latex gloves as well. But it is important to us that you know what safety precautions you need to take, and you've trained your employees in this. We want them to be aware and observant. They should be well enough trained to be able to look at an animal like this and say, oh my gosh, that bat is emaciated. What's wrong with it? And to be able to do that and to complete all of the good husbandry practices that we're expecting you to follow and that you want to follow, you've got to have a supervisor that has some experience and knows how to take care of animals. Employees are really important to train in good observation skills. And one of the things that it's really important for them to know about your animals is when to separate them and how to judge compatibility. Animals that are housed in the same enclosure have to be compatible. And you don't want to house the bats near animals that could cause them discomfort. In other words, you don't want to have predators looming in from the next cage over and scaring those bats and making them uncomfortable. We'll be thinking about things in your facility like, what are the populations in each enclosure? Are the age dynamics such that geriatric animals are getting bullied? Are the age dynamics such that a social species that practices alloparenting can take care of the offspring in a normal social environment for that species? We'll look for any evidence of injury and stress, and we'll ask you about things like, what if you have a breeding colony, what's the production rate? Are things going well with the young ones? And that's how we'll evaluate how it's going. Now, we have an entire talk about safe transportation in bats happening tomorrow, and I really hope you're going to go to that. It's a complex issue. It's a difficult thing to do well, and we actually have regulations that I encourage you to read that cover all of these topics, that cover what kind of enclosures to use, food and water requirements in transit, care in transit, terminal facility conditions in transit, how you're supposed to handle them. The answer to that is with care at all times. And even what those enclosures should look like. So please go to that talk tomorrow. I want to remind you of some key points here. Number one, don't put your animals in a crate too early. Okay, animals should have access to food and water within 4 hours of transportation. Those enclosures should be strong. They need to protect your animals. They've got to be well ventilated, and they've got to have a rim. Why do they have a rim? Because when you have ventilation holes, you have to have room for air to circulate. So making sure you have at least a 3/4 of an inch rim on that crate that ensures that there's good air circulation prevents your bats from getting suffocated. You've got to have good handholds so that somebody can pick up the crates without sticking their fingers through a ventilation hole and getting bitten, or God forbid, allowing a bat to escape. That's really important. At the same time, if there's an emergency, you have to be able to get to those animals quickly. So if you have a crate, for example, that is closed with Godzilla-like strength and locked, then you've got a problem because nobody could get to those animals in the event of an emergency. And hopefully, when you're packing these animals, you're paying special attention to the fact that they really have to be put in there with compatible crate mates so that those kinds of emergencies are less likely to be generated. Also, remember, when you put a number of animals in one enclosure, you still have to allow them enough room to make normal postural adjustments. You have to have a solid bottom to a crate. There has to be something on the bottom of that crate that will catch the wastes so that your animals aren't going to swim around in it. And you've got to have some hints to people who might be handling that crate about how to orient it. You want to have these signs that say live animals with arrows pointing up. And likewise, another important aspect of signage on that crate is to have documents for their care and transport attached to it. So nobody has to go wandering off to an office or call somebody for those instructions. It's right there on the crate. Similarly, we're going to be looking at those crates in a vehicle, or we're going to be looking at the vehicle you're going to put the crates in when we do an inspection. We want to see that there's not going to be any exhaust fume pollution in the area that those crates are put into. And we want to make sure that there's not something like dry ice in that particular section of the transport vehicle that might off-gas and suffocate your animals. They should be nice, clean vehicles so that there's no risk to your animals of becoming contaminated by the previous load of animals that was in there. And we want to make sure that you are packing snacks. This is really important. And that there was an excellent and very sad story told earlier today about animals that didn't have enough food for their journey. You've got to pack enough food so that those animals have 24 hours worth of their needs. You've got to feed them at least once every 24 hours, and they've got to be provided water at least twice in a 24-hour period, so once every 12 hours. How do you know if an animal's in trouble in transit? You should be checking on them, and that is a requirement of transport, that as long as those crates are accessible, in other words, not 30,000 feet above the earth in the belly of a plane, you're checking on them every 4 hours and making sure that they're comfortable and doing well. We do have a lot of resources that can help you out with your questions about the various species we inspect. And I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Dr. Gage to talk about that. Laurie?
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Sarah. So we do have, as previously mentioned, we have a lot of helpful publications. We have animal care aids, and we have tech notes that will help you. We already discussed the attending veterinarian tech notes. We also have the animal care aid about flying and gliding species. All of these can be found on our publications website. And not only that, we have lots of other species that we cover and give best practice ideas. We have lots of offerings for non-human primates, non-domestic cats, sloths, giraffes, bears. So we have a lot of different aids for the variety of animals in your various collections that might be of use to you. So you could just go find these on our publications page. And with that, I'd like to thank all of these wonderful people for their assistance with this presentation. And I'd like to open up this up for questions if we have time.